Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is James Lamond. I'm the director of the Democratic Resilience Program here at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us for today's event, CEPA Live, Putin Marches on Ukraine. Yesterday, President Vladimir Putin officially recognized as independent the Ukrainian regions of Donetsk and Luhansk as the so-called People's Republics. He subsequently ordered a peacekeeping mission to the region. This is obviously something that we've been keeping a close eye on and have been anticipating for quite some time. But this seems to be the beginning of a concerning situation, to say the least. President Biden will be speaking on this at any moment, and we're expecting him to announce new sanctions. And so hopefully we'll be able to get some real-time responses from our panel of experts. But joining us today to help us make sense and understand of what's happening on the ground and with the international response, we have with us a fantastic panel. Olga Tokaryuk is a non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis and a journalist joining us from Ukraine. Olga Lautman is a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. And Max Bergman is a senior fellow for Europe and Russia with the Center for American Progress and a former State Department official. So we only have a little bit of time here, so we're gonna jump in to the questions right away. I want to start off with Olga Tokaryuk. First of all, thank you so much for joining us. We are obviously very, very focused on what's happening on the ground right now. And I just want to ask you real quick. Yesterday's speech by Putin focused on the Donbass and the invasion there is clearly the immediate crisis. But it was also clear from his remarks that the goal is something bigger, and he wants more control over Ukraine, more broadly speaking. I guess my question for you is, where do you see the conflict heading, and what direction do you see this taking shape in?
Hi, thank you, James, and thank you everyone for joining. Well, what happened yesterday, this Putin's long speech, shall say to that basically, yes, can you hear me?
So you cut out for 1 second, but please go on. Please go on. We'll give Olga a second, but then maybe we can. Oh, are you back?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, well, hopefully the line will not be dropping. So I was saying that Putin's speech yesterday was pretty outrageous. He reiterated his previous statements that Ukraine is an artificial entity, that he basically denied its right to exist as a sovereign and independent state. He made a lot of colonial, I would even say racist remarks about Ukrainians, saying that they were puppets of the West, they were Nazis and so on. And then he proceeded to recognizing the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics. But it is clear now that the real goal of Putin is not, the recognition of these republics, and he will not stop there. And he himself said today that he recognizes them in their kind of borders that are, written in their constitution, which means in the whole territory of Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine, which would mean that Russia is planning to grab even more territory of Ukraine beyond what is currently controlled in the territory of these republics. And what also was clear after yesterday's speech by Putin is now that the Minsk agreements are officially dead, that Russia is officially exiting the peace process. So it's a major escalation, and there could be various scenarios of how it will develop, but this is definitely heading towards an escalation.
Just following up on the speech from yesterday, I want to turn to Olga Lautman for a second. One of the central themes from Putin's speech was the idea that Ukraine's statehood is a fiction, that this is a country created by Lenin during the early days of the Soviet Union, and this echoes the themes from his 5,000-word essay from last summer. I think the question here is, we're not going to get into all the reasons that this is historically inaccurate and just just completely inaccurate. But I want to ask you about the shaping of the information space, which has been a big part of the run up to the conflict. Um, we've seen disinformation and false flag operations and efforts to shape the narrative in Russia, in Ukraine, and throughout the rest of Europe, even in the U.S. Could you tell us a bit about what you've been seeing and how the information space is being shaped around the conflict?
Hi, thank you everyone for joining. Yeah, so it's been a very interesting week. I mean, this is a very pre-planned, manufactured crisis by Putin on Ukraine. He's been preparing for it for a while. But meanwhile, domestically, the media last week shifted to the humanitarian crisis that they manufactured. I mean, they literally yanked people out of their homes in Donetsk and Luhansk, forced them to evacuate, and then half of their coverage was basically showing what a great thing Russia is doing. Their towns are opening up, and they specifically targeted women, children, and elderly people. And now that is being used as propaganda spread around of what is happening. Their other very significant part of the coverage is the false flag operations. I mean, every other article, Ukrainian military has been told to stand down for now. They have not responded. They didn't want to, do any provocations. Meanwhile, according to Russia, like every hour, there are terrorist attacks, buildings that were hit, 5 buildings collapsed, people were killed, a bomb on a highway, and this is all you see. And then the most dangerous part of it is the Russian Federation Council for Show just authorized Putin to use armed forces and military and aircraft outside of Russian soil. So, I mean, we are definitely heading in very dangerous territory, and he is escalating, and he is going by plan. This is their military strategy for quite a while, and they're basically filling out the military strategy. They're going along with it, but at the same time, they're giving the domestic audience and the global audience, a show between these false negotiations and these, terrorist attacks and everything that is non-existent. I mean, if anything, it's Russian militants who are attacking these areas.
I just want to follow up real quick on the point you raised about the authorization that Putin received for use of military force. I guess, for many people, this may seem like sort of just a box checking exercise, given that Putin has the authority to do what he likes. But I think, could you explain a little bit more about why this is a little bit more than just a box checking exercise, and why this has a bit more of a it's more than just symbolic. It can be it is specifically about pursuing military action.
Because he is telling the world while the West is scrambling with their responses and trying to figure out whether Russian tanks rolling into Donetsk and Luhansk, which has been occupied for 8 years, is an invasion. He is telling the West that he's going full, force with his plans to further invade and attack Ukraine. And I think it's extremely dangerous because, he's getting Russians domestically prepared for war. I mean, it's the same as if Congress gave, Biden an authorization to launch airstrikes and use armed military force overseas. That grabs everyone's attention and lets everyone know war is coming. And to the bigger part of this, I mean, this is something that Putin has had in his sights for a few years. This narrative yesterday, which was absolutely, insane on the surface, is something that he's repeated over and over again. I mean, he has wanted to restore, territory lost after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He is getting older. He's been in power for 2 decades, and over the past year, we saw this escalation. First, he softly annexed Belarus and expanded his military and territory, and now poses a grave threat to Poland, Lithuania, and other EU countries. And we're seeing this with Ukraine and also with Moldova, because they also have, Russian occupied Transnistria, and there are reports that the leaders of Transnistria were in Moscow requesting for the same exact thing that happened with Donetsk and Luhansk.
Thank you for that, Olga. Max, I want to talk to you a little bit about the response that we've seen so far. One of the things that stands out to me is that the degree of coordination and cohesion that, at least in the initial response, is kind of striking. Almost immediately after Putin's speech yesterday, the presidents of the European Council, the European Commission announced, they declared it illegal under international law and announced that sanctions would be coming. We have yet to see what those sanctions actually are. But then immediately after that, the White House announced that President Biden issued an executive order announcing new sanctions. The UK Foreign Secretary came out and made a similar announcement. The messages seem to align at the UN Security Council meeting last night. Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, announced today that Germany would be halting the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So I guess there clearly was a certain degree of coordination that was always an open question. I guess my question for you then is how would you assess the Allied response so far, at least at this initial stage?
Well, James, first, thanks so much for having me, and it's good to be on this panel. I think the Allied response has been quite good. I think look, Nord Stream 2, we've talked about it for years now, and in what was, I think, a sort of typical German move, they killed the pipeline in sort of, no one seems to quite have noticed, but they killed it through a bureaucratic move where basically they're not going to go through with certain permitting, which then means that the German government can't be sued for delaying the pipeline. I think was quite smart. But I think what we have to sort of understand is that I think Putin's remarks were quite shocking. And in particular, I think to a European audience, I would think that that effectively it means that the Minsk process is dead. And I think there was this effort, particularly by President Macron and Olaf Scholz, I think quite clear-eyed, knowing that it was unlikely to work. But when Putin just sort of goes on television and gives an hour-plus speech where then he kills the Minsk process, I think that was sort of quite a slap in the face to the diplomatic efforts in Europe. I do think there's a bit of an effort for a lot of people to put the cart before the horse when it comes to the overall Allied response. I think everyone is now expecting a broader Russian invasion, and then therefore want to see the U.S. come out and sort of clearly call what is currently happening an invasion, and then sort of unleash the sanctions. I think there needs to be a little bit of patience. It's not going to matter that much when the sanctions when the full salvo of the initial wave of sanctions are put forth. I think what you saw yesterday, or the time is sort of a blurry space, but the response for the U.S. to do sanctions against Luhansk and Donetsk are fine, but that's not the full sanctions barrage. And so I think what we're seeing is kind of everyone now in this period where we're waiting for Russian tanks to move, not simply through places where they've moved before, but to start moving into toward Kharkiv from Belgorod or toward Kyiv. So, and I think that is when you're going to see the full Allied response. So I think what you've seen so far is a little unclear of what it amounts to. There's some sanctions from the UK. It's been critiqued for not being that strong, and I think that criticism is fair. But I also don't think that that's going to be the last we're going to hear from the United Kingdom about sanctions. And I think we're probably going to hear pretty shortly, perhaps the first salvo of U.S. sanctions. But I think that's not going to be the full wave. I think what the West wants, and I'll maybe close here, is that when we start seeing a full escalatory Russian military invasion of Ukraine, and we're going to know it when we see it, that the West hasn't fired all its ways of imposing costs on Russia, and that is when we're going to see, I think, the full Western response, which has been coordinated now for months.
Thank you. Yeah. I think that is definitely something that's been clear. Is that these were just the initial steps yesterday, and you see even the reports out today that the EU sanctions are looking more towards something along the same lines as the Biden administration announcement last night. But I think there's clear sense that we'll need to ratchet it up as we move along. So we are waiting to hear a bit more from President Biden, which we'll bring in some of those comments and try to get reactions from everybody as those come in. The speech has been delayed slightly, but and I also want to flag for our participants that they are welcome to ask questions and weigh in. Just use the function on the Twitter Spaces app, and then we can incorporate them into the conversation. So if you have a question, please just raise your hand, and then we'll call to you I'll call on you at the right time. But I want to turn back to Olga Tokariuk for a minute. In January, President Biden said that Russia will be held accountable if it invades Ukraine. And after some initial wavering, today the Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner used the invasion word. He said so. He said that that invasion is underway. We're seeing the beginning of it. And so I wanted to turn to Olga Tokariuk. What do you see as the necessary steps to hold Russia accountable? What can be done from Western policymakers' point of view to help create that accountability that President Biden has promised?
Well, that has been outlined already yesterday and today by Ukrainian officials. President Zelensky said that he was expecting a very swift reaction from the West. He said that Russia was moving very quickly in Donbass, that after President Putin's yesterday's decision to recognize this Russian puppet republics, the Russian troops were already crossing the border, which is not under Ukrainian control, and Russian military equipment has been moving to Donetsk. So he asked the West to act as quickly as Russia does. And we've seen already some reactions coming in today, encouraging news from Germany on the Nord Stream 2, and also sanctions by the UK, by the EU. And we are waiting to hear what more US sanctions would be. So on that part, we are seeing the West is already delivering. What else President Zelensky said? He also called to boost the support to Ukraine, to continue delivering the defensive weapons to Ukraine, and also continue delivering economic and financial support, because Ukrainian economy has been suffering tremendously in these weeks and months of this heightened tensions. Yesterday, Ukrainian officials from the office of the president said that Ukraine is losing between $2 and $3 billion monthly because of this Russian military escalation. So these are the directions. And also what I'm hearing from the Ukrainian foreign minister, what he was saying today, he's in Washington actually now in DC, and he's been making briefing from there to tell Ukrainians what is happening on his Facebook page. And he was saying that actually other set of debates that Ukrainian officials are now having with their Western counterparts discuss the kind of Ukraine wants to return to, to put Budapest Memorandum back on the table, to discuss the security assurances that were given to Ukraine back in 1994 in exchange of Ukraine renouncing and abandoning its nuclear program. Ukraine wants security assurances, some kind of security assurances. We still don't have a clear idea what those could be. Kuleba, foreign minister, also said that Ukraine wants from the EU specifically to hear a clear timetable when Ukraine could become the EU member. He thinks now Ukraine has a window of opportunity, and the West also should make unambiguous and very clear and definite statements and outline the timetable for Ukraine's accession into the European Union, because Kyiv believes that it's time now for the West, that Ukraine is part of the West.
Thank you, Max. I want to turn to you actually to pick up on that point about Ukraine's accession process to the EU. I know you've studied the EU quite closely and have really thought about the structures of the organization. I guess, can you comment a bit about the prospects for EU accession process for Ukraine?
Well, I think the process would be a very long-term one. The EU currently has basically put the Balkans on ice in terms of ascension. I think there's a sense, particularly in Western Europe, in France in particular, that basically the EU expanded significantly, now has 27 members, yet didn't do enough to kind of adequately reform how its decision-making structures are done. Given that you need unanimity within the EU Council, for instance, to do anything on foreign policy, it makes it hard for the EU to act globally, for the EU to take any decision, whether that's on green energy transition, rule of law, or any sort of step that requires unanimity and requires all 27 members of the European Council. So I think before the EU expands, there's going to have to be some internal reforms within the EU, which currently isn't really in the cards. Now, that said, I do think that Ukraine is on the right track in saying that is the larger objective, is to be incorporated into the EU. And I think to get back to part of the discussion about NATO, about an open door membership to NATO, is I think the West hasn't done a great job of articulating this to Russia and to the Russian people, is that also includes Russia, right? Part of the reason why the West and the United States and others would never sort of say that Ukraine could never be a part of NATO is that also frankly applies to Russia, and that if Russia were to have a different government that was pursuing a liberal path, that perhaps there is a relationship. Now, I don't see Ukraine membership within the EU coming in the short term. A lot of internal reforms would have to be done. And I think obviously the fact that Ukraine doesn't control its entire territory would be quite concerning to the European Union. But that said, I think Ukraine is on the right track in pushing the EU to think more creatively about how to make Ukraine more prosperous, because that is the thing that has sort of been Ukraine has been stuck between Russia and the EU. And while the EU has offered, where there is an association agreement, that hasn't quite delivered the economic goods that I think many had hoped. And I think there's incumbent on the EU to find a way to sort of, especially if as Ukraine emerges through this crisis, to figure out what is the future relationship between Ukraine and the EU. Maybe it isn't quite membership, but it's more than an association agreement, in that you can move Ukraine toward European Union membership.
That's a great point. Even Putin himself, according to some reports, I think it's a bit conflicted by some reports. Putin himself was talking about Russian membership in NATO back 20-something years ago. But that's an interesting point.
Just on that, this was part of the U.S. government consideration in the 90s. I've even seen memos from the early Bush administration, discussing or thinking about Russian potential membership of NATO. That part of this whole thing about NATO expansion, this is just a quick aside, is that in the 90s there was this conception, and perhaps it was optimistic and it was not realistic, but that Russia would eventually become incorporated and included. And so all this talk of that the NATO moved to go into Russia's sphere, I think really dismisses the context of that time.
That's a great point. That we don't necessarily think of it in these conversations, but that's a great point. So again, I want to remind our listeners, if anybody wants to join the conversation, please feel free to use the function in the Twitter Spaces. Just raise your hand, and then we can bring you in. But I do want to quickly turn back to Olga Lautman for a second, because I think I know you follow the conversation in Russia very closely, and one of the things that we've seen is that the reaction to Putin's decision has been a little bit more mixed than is typically the case, right? So even some of the more hawkish voices have expressed a degree of skepticism about the decision. I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about how well this is playing. What is the reaction in Russia that you are seeing as you monitor the conversation, the media, and the press, and what are the do you anticipate any sort of potential pushback on this as the crisis escalates?
Well, I wanted to give a quick update on sanctions first, because the EU just released the strictest sanctions. let me get to it. They are proposing to sanction every Russian parliamentary deputy who voted in favor of recognizing Russia's occupied territory in Ukraine. That would pretty much include all of them. Back to the response. When I talk to people privately, it's mixed. Some people don't want to go to war. Having a war is the last thing they want. Publicly, they are pretty much silenced. Right now, you cannot, speak out against the Kremlin. You cannot speak out against their decision. There was a video that floated of a poor, grandpa who came out with one sign the other day against the war, and he was arrested in about 4 seconds and dragged off by, internal ministry. So publicly, they really can't do much right now. I mean, will this turn into a shift and, a potential downfall eventually of Putin's regime? It could, because if Russia is turned into a pariah state, it's going to affect Russian people. It's going to affect all the oligarchs surrounding him. So definitely for long term, that can happen. But right now, short term, people just publicly can't speak. FSB, will come and pick you up for liking a post on social media. Forget even mentioning, speaking out against the war. There were a few generals who came out. Well, one general who came out, with an essay on basically calling to arrest Putin and to take him out of office. He did the same thing last year at the start of the buildup. It was significant, but again, it didn't get that much reaction inside. So right now, and the way the Russian government is structured, it is very much like the Soviet government. Putin really, I talk about Putin attempting to reinstate territory on the, his that was lost during the Soviet Union. He is doing the same exact thing domestically for the past few years. I mean, he really is bringing back Soviet practices of silencing people that we haven't seen in decades.
Thank you. So as you were just to follow up on Olga's point too about the EU sanctions package that was just announced as we were speaking, a couple more details. They're targeting all individuals, as Olga said, all the individuals involved in the decision. They're targeting the banks that are financing Russian military and other operations in those territories. And target the ability of the Russian state government to access EU's capital and financial markets, and then also along the lines of the Biden administration's executive order from yesterday, targeting the breakaway regions. I guess so. Olga Tokarczuk, I want to turn to you to see, what is your reaction to the EU sanctions package? Obviously, this is, as you mentioned, is moving. This is following the request from President Zelensky to move quickly. This is a coordinated response, but is this a sort of is this a first step that we are, or is this going to be, is this essentially the initial stage of what we're hoping for, or do we need to move a little bit faster as we're formulating the response to kind of keep up with Putin, as you said?
Well, I think it's an encouraging sign that the sanctions were agreed so quickly, because as we know, in the EU, there are a lot of disagreements between individual countries on the level of sanctions they are ready to apply on Russia. And so far, we are seeing that the EU is moving pretty quickly. Although from my sources, I know that there were disagreements even today with some countries not very certain even on this sort of sanctions. Hopefully, this dynamics will be preserved in the future, because, my belief is, it's not going to end there. It's not now. It's not going to de-escalate. It's not going to become quiet, because also the signs and the news we receive from the front line are not very encouraging in this moment. I just checked the news that Ukrainian positions are under heavy shelling from the Russian artillery. in the last days, several Ukrainian servicemen were killed, and yesterday a civilian person was also killed as a result of artillery shelling. So the situation along the front line is deteriorating, the security situation is deteriorating, and we could expect more Russian military movements in the next days. So I think what is very important is to maintain this momentum and this pace in the West, not, allow Putin and his corrupt money to sow divisions in the West. I hope this unity and this quick reaction will be preserved, and the EU and the US and the UK will continue to demonstrate readiness to act swiftly and to stop Putin, because he won't stop until he's stopped.
Thank you. So we're going to start to wrap up soon, as that way everyone can listen to the president's remarks if they're interested. But I do want to do a round of closing remarks, and we'll go in reverse order from the way we started. So it'll be Max, Olga Lautman, and then Olga Tokariuk. So I get the question is, what is the message that you think needs to be heard right now by both U.S. policymakers, European policymakers, and in Russia? So Max, first to you, and just include anything you want, any closing messages you'd like to include as well.
Well, I think maybe just to close, maybe to compare this a little bit to 2014 when I was in the U.S. government, and 2014, the seizure of Crimea, the instigation of violence in eastern Ukraine, all happened in some ways very suddenly, and caught everyone off guard, especially within the United States and the U.S. government, but also in Europe. And so it took a long time to create a joint U.S. EU sanctions effort. It really wasn't until the summer, till the downing of MH17. And so I think you can contrast that with the response now, which is Putin has, given the West and NATO and the United States a ton of lead time to coordinate their efforts. And I think what we've seen, at least rhetorically thus far, is a really strong commitment from the U.S. and NATO countries to respond. And the rhetoric is that essentially that the response to Russia will cause immense economic damage to the Russian economy, to the economic well-being of the Kremlin. And I think that is in the cards. And then I think what will happen is that the sanctions are going to be quite strong. They're going to target Russian banks. I think the export controls that have been discussed are kind of a relatively new tool, but could have real impact. But then a lot of this is going to require some adjustment. It's going to require coordination. It's going to, people point out things that the US and the EU have not done. And so I think we're going to see sort of a back and forth between a US-European response. There'll be some good things. There'll be some things that perhaps could be strengthened. And then I think we'll see tightening. And I think in particular, just to maybe close, I think what we'll see in the United States is that if there is a sense that the response isn't quite strong enough and could be stronger, well, the U.S. Congress is going to trip over themselves to take any action that they can that will strengthen the U.S. response. And so I think where we're headed when it comes to sanctions vis-a-vis Russia is it may not happen on day one, it may not happen on the first month, but eventually we're going to see Russian sanctions toward Russia look more like sanctions toward Iran, which then leads to a massive kind of economic calamity for Russia. And I think that's what this will be. And this will be felt by the Russian people. And that's in some ways tragic. But when you invade and dismember, or potentially invade and dismember, a democratic neighbor, that's the cost. And I think that's what we're going to see from the U.S. and from the international community.
Yeah, I think the comparison to the Iran sanctions is the right way to think about it, where it is going to be much more significant than anything we saw in 2014, and I think that is exactly where the direction that we'll be heading in. But I want to turn to Olga Lautman next. Olga, what are the messages you want to get across, and are there any other closing remarks you want to include?
I think that U.S. should follow the path of EU by sanctioning all diplomats who voted for, everything that Putin is proceeding with, including any future military actions. Because, as much as they domestically, push the propaganda of how bad the West is, they all own property and have all their assets parked in the West. So that is definitely a good strategic move. I am very impressed with the US government and the British government for um, uh, basically winning in the information warfare with Russia by releasing intelligence as they receive it, because that definitely has put the Kremlin, on kind of shaky footing, as far as they're so used to controlling the narrative, and here they're more scrambling for a response. And I also think Russia will escalate with cyber attacks against Europe and US very quickly after sanctions are, enacted. So I think we need to be prepared to do the same, to respond back to them.
Yeah, that's a great point you raised about the exposure of the sort of the false flag operations and the overall hybrid tactics that have been used, where it's almost like you're seeing a new policy and a new approach to hybrid warfare in real time as these plots have been exposed, and then letting transparency be the sort of the deterrent effect there. So it's really, I'm wondering if that's not going to be something that we see more of moving forward as a general strategy and approach to these sort of below threshold activities that we've been experiencing over the past couple of years. But so for the closing remarks, though, I want to turn to Olga Tokaryuk. What are the messages you want U.S. policymakers to hear, you want European leaders to hear, as well as those in Russia that may be listening? I just really want to thank you again for joining us and give you the floor.
Yes, well, since I'm speaking to you from Ukraine, I think I want to pass the message on behalf of Ukraine and Ukrainians, that Ukrainians are willing to resist. They are willing to defend their country. They understand the seriousness of the threat and the risks, but they have, a lot to lose. They have their country to lose. They have their future to lose. They have, the future of their children to lose, and also the memory of all those people, 14,000 people who were already killed in this conflict since Russia first invaded in 2014. So be sure that Ukrainians will be fighting. They will be resisting further Russian aggression, whatever form and shape it might take. But Ukraine would need your support, which might come in different forms. It's great that some sanctions are already being rolled out. It's great that more, weapons and financial assistance is coming to Ukraine. But I think also the West should think out of the box. And I'm actually thinking that it's a very good idea that the Ukrainian officials and the government is pursuing a strategy of small alliances with the UK and Poland that was announced last week, closer cooperation with Turkey. So if NATO membership for Ukraine is not on the table yet, I think it's a very good strategy to pursue, this, to form small alliances and to see how countries that have expressed like the most support to Ukraine, who understand all the threat that Russia poses, how they can help now immediately without the need to convene, 30-member alliance or 27-member alliance. So the message is that Ukraine is going to fight as it was doing for the last 8 years to protect not only Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, that Ukraine is going to protect the security of whole of Europe. Ukraine is now on the front line defending basically not just security, but also democracy globally. And I think it should be also kept in mind and understood all over the West that Ukrainians are not only fighting for themselves, they are fighting for the democratic and free West as well.
Well, that is an excellent message to close on, and really appreciate everyone's time, both our participants who are able to join from around the world, and also our fantastic panelists, Max Bergman, Olga Lautman, Olga Tokariuk. Thank you all for joining us. Please see the SIPA website. There's lots of resources there, including analysis from some of our experts today, but also a broader collection of insights and analysis. So this is a conversation we will be participating in over the next couple weeks and months. And so really wanted to thank everybody again for joining us, and take care.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.